Welcome, this is Christy Brosmer. I'm going to be discussing with you the chapter on collective behavior and social movements. This is chapter 23 in our sociology textbook. So I'm going to first start by describing the characteristics of collective behavior. Collective behavior is known as being diverse, variable, and transitory. This basically means that collective behavior is different, subject to change, and temporary. Collective behavior is defined in two ways. First, we're going to describe and define collectivity. Collectivity is basically a large number of people who engage in minimal interaction. People in collectivities have little or no social interaction. Collectivities have no clear social boundaries, and collectivities generate weak and unconventional norms, largely because of the other two defining points. But you also have two different types of collectivities. First, you have localized collectivities. These are people who are physically close to one another. They're exemplified through the idea of crowd and riot. Then you have dispersed collectivities. These are collectivities that are spread out. An example would be mass behavior. So let's start by defining and talking about the different types of crowds. Crowds are actually defined by Herbert Blumer in 1969. He defined them by looking at the different types of crowds that he saw develop in the world. First, you have casual crowds. These are loose collections with little interaction. Imagine going to a really big mall. Or if you've ever been to Chicago on a weekend, try going to one of those museums. That's an example of casual crowd. Conventional crowds result from a deliberate planning. This would be something like going to a concert. Expressive crowds, these are events with emotional appeals. Basically, you have a particular type of expressive crowd that develops, and those are called mobs. Mobs are highly intense emotional crowds that pursue a violent or destructive goal or goals. Lynchings are examples of mobs. Acting crowds are motivated by intense single-minded purpose. Riots would be the best example of an acting crowd. Basically, riots occur when there's social eruption that is highly emotional, violent, usually undirected. There's no clear goal except to express dissatisfaction. Protest crowds are motivated by political purpose. So, why do crowd behaviors develop? You have two opposing ideas regarding crowd behavior, and then we'll talk about the one that kind of falls in the middle. Contagion theory is a theory developed by Laban. Basically, he suggests that crowds have a hypnotic influence on their members. Crowds rely on anonymity. In other words, in a big group of people, people can behave differently than they normally would. Why? Because no one knows how they're behaving. No one sees them as the individual. Instead, it's the entire group. The convergence theory is the opposite of the contagion theory. It holds that crowd behavior comes not from the crowd itself, but from the particular people who join in. It states that people who wish to act in a certain way come together to form crowds. They develop it. So with the contagion theory, you have the crowd itself being very important in stimulating the way people behave. Convergence theory, it suggests that people presuppose the development of the crowd or the group. They act that way because they want to act that way. And then you have the emergent norm theory. This is developed by Ralph Turner and Louis Killiam in 1987. They both suggest that if similar interests draw people into a crowd, then distinctive patterns of behavior may emerge. Again, this represents the middle ground view. So let's talk about types of mass behavior. The first four you're probably more familiar with. Why? Because we see them often in our society, and they're easily identifiable. We also talked about these four when we discussed types of pop culture. First, you have rumors. These are unconfirmed information types. Basically, they thrive in a climate of uncertainty. They tend to be unstable. They're difficult to stop. Then you have that type which is called gossip, which is rumor about a person or people's personal affairs. This can be very damaging and generally occurs against celebrity figures. Then you have fashion. This is a social pattern favored by a large number of people. Fashion, by the way, does not just mean clothing styles. You have public opinion. This is widespread attitudes about controversial issues. And then fads, unconventional patterns embraced briefly. Sometimes these occur in cycles. Then you have propaganda. You should all be familiar with different types of propaganda, but we're going to review a few today. Propaganda is information presented with the intention of shaping public opinion. This was first defined by Jowett and O'Donnell, who were both sociologists, back in 1938. They basically stated that propaganda is deliberate, systematic, it attempts to shape our perceptions, it attempts to manipulate our cognitions, in other words, our thinking, it attempts to direct behavior, and it works to the end of the propagandist or whomever they are working for. You have different types of propaganda. First is assertion. This is basically an enthusiastic or energetic statement presented as fact, although that may not be the case. It may not be true. Assertions oftentimes are direct lies. Assertions may state the product, person, or ideology is best without providing credible evidence to actually suggest this is true. One of the most common forms of propaganda is bandwagon. Basically, you should join or buy this or do this or vote for this person because everybody's doing it. Card stacking. This is also known as selective omission. It's basically where propaganda is only presenting positive information. Glittering generalities. This is a pretty common method. Basically, with this type of propaganda, we see that there's value and honor associated with the product, person, or ideology, oftentimes because of the ways in which we present other images alongside of them. So, for instance, the American flag is oftentimes used in political commercials as well as beer commercials. This is an example of glittering generality. Lesser of two evils. Basically, this form of propaganda suggests that the person, product, or idea is the least offensive. We know that's been used in politics over the course of the last 8 years. Name-calling. This is also a favorite for politicians. This is basically where we use derogatory language or words to reference the opposition. This is where we conjure a particularly negative idea in the public mind and evoke feelings rather than rationale regarding a person, product, or idea. So, for instance, the claim that Mitt Romney hates women would be an example of this, as well as calling Obama a communist and a Muslim. Plain folks. This has been around a lot longer than most forms of propaganda. It suggests that everybody is going to use this product who's the average person. In other words, Joe, who's running for political office, is just like you or I. Simplification. This is a clear-cut choice between good and evil when there is an obvious complex situation. Basically, this is the good aspect, this is the bad aspect. This can involve commercials like those who are selling particular prescription drugs. Seeing the alternative as being far worse, seeing the pill to calm the drug or calm the illness down would be the positive, when in reality there's a lot more going on in those kinds of situations than just taking a pill. Testimonial. This is basically where we link popular, respectable, or famous people to the product, person, or idea being sold. So, for instance, in the 1970s and 1980s, we see that athletes begin to back cereals. So this asserted that basically I won the race or I got the gold medal. Why? Because I ate my Wheaties. That's a form of testimonial. Today we see that occur with proactive commercials. Jessica Simpson doesn't have any blemishes. She's beautiful. Why? Because she uses Proactiv. This is an example of testimonial. Then finally you have transfer. Transfer is really similar to other types of propaganda. However, it attempts to make us view one person, item, or ideology with another that is either positive or negative. Whether it is positive or negative is dependent on how you want the public to view what you are selling. So in other words, I'm transferring the idea of this politician with some other politician. For instance, with Mitt Romney and Bush in the last election. Finally, we have mass hysteria. This is dispersed collective behavior. You have two different types. First is panic, a form of collective behavior in which people in one place react to a threat or other stimulus with irrational, frantic, and self-destructive behavior, or at least it's oftentimes self-destructive. It's not what causes the panic that can be as destructive as rather the people's behavior that follows the act. Then you have disaster, an event generally unexpected that causes extensive harm to people and damage to property. Some types of disasters are intentional, while others are unintentional and can even be natural disasters. Kai Erikson actually discussed the ways in which society is harmed by disasters, and he supposed that there are certain types of disasters that lead to more harm for people. First, social events lead to great social harm. In other words, disasters that are social in nature, like the 9/11 bombing, would be an example of one that causes a lot of social damage. It can cause paranoia, anger, agitation, frustration as to why this happens. Then you have social damage becoming more serious when it involves, of all things, toxic substances. 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl are examples where we see the social damage is much higher. Social damage is also more serious when caused by the actions of others. There's a loss of trust. This occurs when we see a politician or political group, country, society, government, state, private industry, or even private citizens